Hello, everyone. Welcome to ITS 350. Welcome to the class. So today I'll be doing a lecture of a topic called risk assessment. It's one of the topics we have to cover in the course. Also, I remind you on Thursday we will be doing the scavenger hunt, or also called the crypto practical exam, which is, I think I've explained this several times. I'm going to hide a message. I'm going to cover it with some layers of encryption. I'm going to give you, it's not that complicated, but it's, as I said, basically there's going to be a hidden message, secret message, and then you will have to find the message by applying some your knowledge basically of cryptography. I'll provide a lot of files, several files, public keys, private keys, symmetric keys. The problem is I may encrypt a lot of these. I could give you two and tell you to select one based on the hash value, things like that. So I haven't obviously loaded any of the files because I will do that at 4 o'clock on Thursday. And then you will have until 10 p.m. that evening to submit your results. Okay, remember, I actually only do a 2-hour. Usually I would do this in the lab for the 2-hour period, but given that this whole pandemic, I'm going to give you more time. So you'll have from 4 all the way to 10 p.m. And that should cover, even if you need extra time, that's plenty of time to submit. All right, so that will be, so that will be on Thursday, the scavenger hunt. For those of you, so most of you, I think, have already done your PyCrypto demo, which is this one. I believe, most groups have done that already. If you still haven't done so, then what we're going to do on Thursday is that at 4 o'clock, I'll get on this and just explain, okay, here's the scavenger hunt, and I might give a few information. But then after that, you guys can just go and work on the scavenger hunt, and any group that still needs to do their PyCrypto demo should stay and do it. That will be the last opportunity you have to do this, okay? There's some groups that have already gone like twice, so I can't, this is gonna be the last opportunity. Hopefully it's not that many groups left. If you did not, so I'm getting questions like this. If you did a presentation and you did not do all the tasks, you're going to have to do it again. And I'm going to change the sentence again, okay? So, but if you did everything, then I told you, okay, you did a great job, and I gave you a grade, and I told you to look at your grade on Brightspace. But otherwise, you will have to demo again on Thursday if you were doing well, but you didn't do the last part, authentication. Unfortunately, you didn't complete the task, so you have to demo. And I'm going to change the sentence, so you're going to have to do all of it. All right? Any other questions about either PyCrypto demos or the scavenger hunt?
I don't think so.
Right, so with the scavenger hunt, I mean, hopefully you'll have your code ready, but I will provide some code files as well. Some students have done their demos during office hours, so that's another question. If you would like to do that so that you have time to work on the scavenger hunt, as soon as it starts, that's fine. On Thursday, from 2 to 4, just show up and you can do your demo there. If you're ready, I mean, it doesn't take more than 15 minutes really, so just, be ready. But yes, you can do your demo during your PyCrypto demo during the Office hours on Thursday between 2 to 4. And remember, at 4, we will start the scavenger hunt. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions, guys? All right. Seems like all questions have been answered. The other thing I ask you, please, as a reminder, keep working on your term project. Remember, we're getting very close to the end of the semester. Remember, next week is Thanksgiving, and that's a short week. And then after that, pretty much, it's just the last week before we're done, right? So make sure you're constantly working on the term project. Okay. So we are very much at the end of the semester, and we are actually, once we are done with the scavenger hunt, we are literally done with all the crypto topics in this course. However, the principles do relate to other things. Okay, so usually at the end of the semester, during these last couple of weeks, I just throw in some miscellaneous topics in there. Obviously, there's a lot more in cryptography that I did not cover. You know, there's, for instance, VPNs, but VPNs have to do with networking and network security. So that's a topic, and with TLS. So all of those topics will be covered when you guys take ITS 454, which is your network security class. All right, so, but this, you know, I think by now, hopefully you have a good, you know, given these two exams I'm seeing, PyCrypto and with the scavenger hunt, you know, I have a sense that you guys understood the concepts and hopefully won't forget. So that's the idea. So today is one of those days where I will cover, you know, the miscellaneous topics that I have. All right, so this is one topic, RCM, which stands for the Risk and Control Matrix. It's a topic that is actually covered in a lot of classes, okay? You will see, I'm sure this topic was probably covered. Right, so another question is the reports for PyCrypto. Yeah, so before I forget, so reports for PyCrypto, this one, right? The report I had said, what is today? Today's the 17th, the 19th. So all I have to do is change this date to the 19th, okay? So that should update, and now that Dropbox should be open in the system, I believe. And then you let me know if it isn't, but you can submit your report. If you notice, for the PyCrypto lab, there's 2 columns in the system, so it's worth basically 2 labs, the demo and the report. Obviously, if you do well in the demo, you're going to do well on the report as long as you submit a good report. Okay. Any other questions before I get RCM? Okay, it seems like there's no more questions. All right, so as I was saying, there's a few miscellaneous topics that we cover in all the security classes, and RCM is one of them. All right, RCM stands for the Risk and Control Matrix. You can see that I've added 3 PowerPoints: security auditing, risk assessment, and physical and infrastructure security. So these are a few of the concepts that I will cover you know, today and possibly next week. And they are really non-technical things, okay? So they're non-technical, but they do relate to the pillars once again, right? They relate to the fact that, you know, you always, whenever you think of security, you're gonna think, you have to think in a certain way. So they're basically, you know, right now in this course, you focus a lot on cryptography. But you know that cryptography is just a technical solution to provide confidentiality, integrity, authentication, and all of that. However, if let's say that you were hired as a consultant or as an employee for an organization, and they don't have any security in place, right? So the question would be, where would you start? Do you just go out and buy a VPN device and get some cryptography algorithms and, you know, and implement it? No, right? You have to take, there's a procedure, there's a process that you're going to follow so that you can, at the end of the process, you know, provide, you know, a document, a report, if you will, that summarizes your view of the risks to the organization and how you mitigate those risks, which is going to be based on administrative, technical, and other types of solutions, right? So technical and non-technical. But here, the focus of this slides is then on creating this report, all right? And so what we're going to study is really this procedure that we can follow to develop all of this, okay? So that's the goal. And we're going to think about this, of course, once again, from the point of view of the principles, you know, that we've been studying all semester. All right, so that is the goal. All right, so you guys are seeing bright space. So now what I have to do is I'm going to open up the slides, okay, and I'm going to open all three, and then I'm going to share them with you guys. I'm not sure if you guys are seeing. I sometimes don't understand this Zoom and how it does things. Confusing. All right. So let's see. I don't know. Are you guys seeing? Okay, you're not seeing the slides. So I need to. Okay. So now you should be seeing the slides. All right. And the slide that you should be seeing right now is the one called IT Security Management and Risk Assessment. Okay. So this is basically, as I said today, we're looking at things from the beginning. How do we start? Kind of the administrative thing. And like I said, this is something that you probably saw in 250. You're going to see again in 454 and other classes probably, because this is actually really important. Okay. It's really where you begin with your knowledge. This is the tool. Okay. And even though it's really the outcome of this, it would be maybe like a report or a binder with no technical information at all, it is actually quite important, right? And it's really what everyone will look at whenever they're, you know, either auditing your organization or doing any kind of work related to the assurance of the organization. They will start at this document. They won't just start at the technical aspects. Okay, so let's begin then. All right, so IT security management and the risk assessment process. So here we're going to look at, you know, an IT security management overview. All right, so basically, as I said, there's a formal process that you want to follow when you establish security for your organization, right? So you're going to start with what assets need to be protected? How are those assets threatened? All right, and what can be done to counter those threats, right? And that's why this is called the risk and control matrix. So if you think about it, these are controls. These are the risks. And then these are the assets that you want to protect, right? So these are the three main ideas. So really, you know, whenever you're doing whenever you're thinking about this, all you have to do is remember these three words, right? You have to find out, okay, for any organization, any problem, what is it that I want to protect? What are the assets? And then what is the risk to that asset? And then what is the control that I should put in place. So for instance, the asset could be the information in your email servers, right? So information about, you know, secrets, you know, maybe it's, what is it? The intellectual property of your organization, the trade secrets, right? And that information is what you're trying to protect in your servers. The risk is that somebody could hack your systems or ransomware or something like that, try to steal your data. And then what controls do you put in place? Well, obviously you know, maybe you implement some kind of a encryption and, you know, firewalls and all kinds of things like that. All right. So it basically ensures that critical assets are sufficiently protected in a cost-effective manner. Keep in mind, you know, you can't just hire an army of IT people to protect your data, right? There's a cost associated with everything. So then we have the security risk assessment, which is, okay, I know what my assets are that I'm trying to protect. Now I need to assess, you know, what are the risks for each, you know, to each asset that requires protection. So how, you know, how do you assess that, quantify that, etc. It provides the information necessary to decide what management, operational, and this is important, what managerial, operational, and technical controls are needed to reduce the risks identified. Okay? That's why usually I call this the risk RCM, the risk and control matrix. And it's really, you know, this is the key idea of what we're doing today, right? So we're just doing this as a tool, okay? And then basically there's going to be a relationship between all these elements, right? So you're going to create, usually the output would be like an Excel spreadsheet where you list all the assets, and then associated with all those assets, you have the risks, and then associated with all those assets and risks, you're going to have controls that are cost effective in order to mitigate these problems. Okay? So that's the general idea of the process. So, so the IT security management then is a process used to achieve and maintain appropriate levels. And you can see once again, you know, we're back at the principles, right? So it's a process used to achieve and maintain appropriate levels of confidentiality, integrity, availability, authenticity or authentication, reliability of the data, and accountability. So there's a couple new ones here, right? Availability and accountability. So availability is that the server doesn't go down. So for instance, that a denial of service attack doesn't happen, right? So just remember that principle. I mean, it can be ensured in other ways through authentication. For instance, you authenticate so that no unauthorized users don't get access to the system and take it down. But also a denial of service when you overload the system. You know, that those are threats to that pillar, right? And then the other pillar here, accountability, is an important one. This is not about defending necessarily directly, it's more indirect, where in accountability, you kind of keep track. In accountability, you keep track of everything that has happened by logging the information. This is the reason why we have user accounts, for instance, right? So every system has a user account. Used to be that people could, you know, log in, just guest or whatever, or no user, but accountability now, you know, you want to know who did what in the system, and that usually can be achieved through accountability. Right, so you can see again, you know, we fall back to the principles, and that's really what governs how we can think of security. In general, it's a good strategy to follow. So the process here, you can think of it as, you know, sort of a pipeline. So basically determining organizational IT security objectives, strategies, and policies, right? So you start to understand the business. You determine organizational IT security requirements, you look at the requirements, then identifying and analyzing security threats to IT assets. Now, keep in mind, IT assets aren't necessarily just physical devices. So they're not necessarily servers or computers. They can also be intangible things like the reputation of the organization, the data, you know, all kinds of things like that. Data is worth, it's a commodity nowadays. Imagine if somebody stole all the data from Twitter, right? You know, or Facebook. Well, Facebook and Twitter sell that data, your personal data actually, to, you know, for commercial purposes, right? And so they make a lot of money. You know, I think there's a statistic that says that Google has so much cash that they could buy cash. I don't mean, you know, I don't mean like, you know, assets. I mean literally cash, that they could buy the Boeing company 2 times. So that's how much money data generates for them, because Google, all it does is, you know, it serves ads and things like that for the information that you do or you search on the engine. So think about it, right? So losing that data for them would be very valuable. So what's important to think about is that assets aren't necessarily all just tangible things. So I've noticed in the class, students often make that mistake. They always just think, oh, the server, the computer, the printer. That printer at Google may not be as valuable as the data that they're trying to protect. All right, once you identify that, you then identify and analyze the risks, right? So you want to quantify in some way. It doesn't have to be very complex, but you want to identify what, you know, if there's some risk, what exactly is it? Is it, because there's some risk that you could accept, you know, if it's just going to damage like a server or a printer and take it down for a couple of days. There are other ones that are business critical, and so they, you know, you wouldn't want those to be affected. Once you've identified the assets and the risks, then the next step is to specify appropriate safeguards, or usually the term is the controls. Right, the controls that are going to be in place. And these, as I said, at this point, you don't necessarily have to define them as, oh, I'm going to use hash functions or RSA, right? So it doesn't have to be that technical initially. Initially, you can just say cryptography for confidentiality, and that, you know, that should answer the question. What technology you use after that, you know, that's something else. But you know that you've answered the question by saying crypto for confidentiality, or you say password for authentication, or you say like, you know, boiler key for authentication, or biometrics for authentication, right? So you just have to get to that level. But once you define all of this, right, once you've gotten to this point, it doesn't mean that you're done. No, then comes the life cycle. So now you have to monitor. So now you have monitoring. So monitoring the implementation and operation of safeguards that are necessary in order to cost effectively protect the information and services within the organization. So you have to monitor and keep track of things, okay? That would be the next step. And then developing and implementing a security awareness program, right? So that's, you know, always you want to communicate with your users. You want to, so communicate with your users. And, you know, basically develop and implement awareness, right? So, you know, so that everyone is always informed and trained, etc. And then finally, you still need to have, well, unfortunately, you may create great systems, but still a hacker or a bad guy gets through. So then, you know, how do you deal with detecting and reacting to incidents? Some of that is going to be the forensics. And some of that is going to be the just how do you respond to a critical issue? How do you deal with it, etc. All right, as we look at the process of IT security management, we can think of it as a life cycle. So you can see this is kind of a life cycle that goes sort of like this, right? You know, it's a cycle, right? And so that's what you have there. So when you do this life cycle, you're going to begin with, you know, some administrative things like some policy and organizational aspects. So you're going to start at a document where you just write a policy. Okay, our policy for remote use policy or login policy or printer policies. You're going to create all these ideas, you know, and they're just basically, you know, in natural language form. They're just, without being very technical, you're just specifying instructions to follow or goals that you want to achieve. After that, then you're going to start thinking about the organization, and this is where the process begins, right? So you identify the assets that you're going to look at, and then you start performing a risk analysis. Risk analysis, as you can see here. Now, the types of analysis that you perform can be, you know, divided into very complex to not very complex, very simple, right? And so they are actually broken up into baseline, informal, formal, and a combined method, okay? And I'll explain that in the next few slides, but it basically just implies that it could be very simple or it could be very complex and expensive. Once you know the assets, once you know the risk analysis, and you've done some kind of an assessment, some kind of quantification, then the next step is the selection of the controls. All right, so you're going to select some controls that will help you. And these are the things that you're going to have to implement, you know, like the cryptography, VPNs, firewalls, etc. The next step is the development of a security plan and procedures to follow. You know, people need to take responsibility for controls, you know, because it doesn't help to just say, oh yeah, we're going to have cryptography if you don't assign that responsibility to a person, right? There's got to be a person that's actually always in charge of that responsibility and who is charged with making sure that everything is done correctly. And then once you have that, then you're going to look at the implementation. So you literally now implement the controls and you begin the process of training, security awareness, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. All right. So once you have that part, then basically, the last part is to follow up. That means to keep track, right? So obviously with every system, you're going to have maintenance, right? There's going to be change management. That means certain things are going to have to change, the security compliance, and the incident handling. And as you can see, it is a kind of a repetitive life cycle process that you're going to follow, okay? And as I said, this is a procedure that makes sense as far as, if you're starting, let's say the best example, starting from scratch, how would you go about implementing, a plan or a process for IT security management? Right, and here there's another abstract view of this, which is basically you plan, you do, you check, you act, right? And it's kind of a cycle that repeats over and over. But that's the same idea as before. All right, so the first thing is you want to identify what is the organizational context and the security policy, right? So you have to start somewhere. And what that means is that you have to start at the organization. What industry are you in? What organization? Do you work in healthcare, right? Healthcare is going to be governed by some laws, Are you a publicly traded company? Okay, you're going to be governed by the laws of, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley and having data in the stock market and the reports that you have to issue, because that affects your stock price, and that has a huge impact in a lot of things, right? Are you in the banking industry? Are you in the entertainment industry? Are you in the airline business, right? The safety of your passengers. So all of these things have to be considered. What type of an organization? Given that, you want to look at periodic security reviews and, you know, something that reflects the risk environment that you're going to be in, which is something that changes constantly, right? Just think of the pandemic and how that, you know, affected a lot of organizations. All right, so first, you know, you can examine the objectives, the strategies, and the policies of the organization, okay? That's really the objective. All right. So let's look at security policy. So as I said, usually you start here and you need to address various things about the organization. These are individual policies. It's basically the scope and purpose, including relation to objectives, to business, legal, and regulatory compliance, IT security requirements, assignment of responsibilities. This one's very important. The risk management approach, you know, does a company accept a lot of risk or none at all, or somewhere in between? Security awareness, personnel issues, any legal sanctions, integration of security into systems development, contingency and business continuity planning, incident detection, and so many, right? So there's a lot of things that need to be thought of when you're trying to secure your organization, okay? And so these, you know, can be represented by a security policy. Okay. So management support, that's another important one here in when you're doing your IT security, right? You have to have the IT security policy or the IT practice, security practice, must be supported by senior management. So you have to have, senior management needs to understand that the security is important, and they do, but you need to be, you know, kind of have your approach in line with management. Right, and so this provides just some administrative recommendations of what you should have. So usually, you know, relates to personnel positions. Now, the security risk assessment. Okay, so the security risk assessment is pretty important. And it relates to now, you know, you've identified your assets, you've identified some risks, and now you want to measure, you know, what is the impact of that risk to my assets and to the organization as a whole. Okay, so that's the other idea. So critical component of the process, ideally examine every organizational asset. However, that's probably not feasible in practice. And we can divide these into baseline, informal, detailed, and combined. And as the name implies, they just relate to how much work you put into defining the risk assessment. For this class, we are basically just going to focus on baseline, you know, the very basic approach, kind of based on rule of thumb. But, you know, companies, insurance companies, for instance, they're experts at quantifying risk, and they take a more detailed approach. So let's look at some of the basics of the baseline approach. So in the baseline approach, the goal is to implement agreed controls to provide protection against the most common threats. Forms a good basis for further security measures, and basically it just uses industry best practices. So really what I would argue is you guys, when you graduate from this program as IT students, you've had a lot of courses in security, so you kind of have a sense of industry best practices, and you'd be in good shape to be able to do this with a baseline approach. You know what assets you want to protect, you know what threats you probably want to look out for, and then you know what controls could be put in place to mitigate those threats. So this one is the easiest and cheapest, can be replicated. It gives no special consideration to variations in risk exposure. And it may give too much or too little security, right? It depends on your own experience and knowledge of the topic. This is generally recommended for small organizations without the resources to implement more structured approaches. Okay, obviously a more structured approach would require more resources of personnel and money. So that's the basic one. The other ones, as you might imagine, informal process, these are, and the other one, these are involved conducting an informal pragmatic risk analysis, exploits knowledge and expertise of the analyst. They are also fairly quick and cheap. Judgment can be made about vulnerabilities. Some risk may be incorrectly assessed. They're skewed towards the analyst, and they're suitable for medium to medium-sized organizations. So these are informal, but they have an expert, right? They involve more experts, a few more people. They're just more detailed, and that's really the idea. And then the detailed risk analysis, you might imagine, you know, it's the most comprehensive approach. We're not going to get into the details of it, but you know, you just have to assume there's a number of stages. You break out all the assets, the threats and vulnerabilities, and you try to quantify in some way with some probabilistic models, maybe, you know, what is the likelihood of something happening? There's obviously going to be significant cost, time, resources, etc. But sometimes you just have to do a detailed risk analysis because it's a legal requirement, right? So if you're governed by HIPAA, you're governed by Sarbanes-Oxley based laws, you know, you're going to have to do it. I mean, there's just no way around. So large organizations, to have accountability, they need to do this. Any questions so far?
I don't have any, at least.
All right. All right, so continue then. As you can see, this is pretty straightforward, but it's still an important thing. The combined approach just implies that, you know, obviously you could use more details, fewer details, so it's a combined approach. All right, so now that we've talked about those methods, you know, kind of we get into the idea of the security risk analysis. So, right, and so the risk assessment methodology you can see here in these slides, we kind of have a pipeline for it. You know, so at step one, the activities would be to characterize the system. Step two, threat identification. Step three, vulnerability identification. Step four, what are the analysis of controls? And then after that, likelihood, you know, of something working or happening, the impact, what is the actual impact of losing, you know, and notice again the principles, losing integrity, availability, confidentiality, right? What is the actual impact of these? You determine the risk based on that, and then now you're ready to make the recommendations on the type of controls you need to have. Okay, and finally, you create some kind of a report. So that's, you know, if you want to think of what would be a pipeline or a methodology, for the risk assessment, you can think of this, and then there's little examples there of the inputs and outputs that would go into all of this. Right, so I'll leave that, I'll leave this figure is very good and leave it to you to read and think about. Remember, you might get some questions about this on the exam at the end of the semester. Okay, so you know, so a few things that you need to consider when you deal with risk assessment is what could be referred to as establishing the context, right? So in establishing the context, what you want to know is, you know, besides knowing the assets, you need to know what is the political and social environment in which the organization operates. And that relates to regulatory and legal things. So in the food industry, right, you know, they're governed by food organizations. Pharmaceuticals are governed by the FDA, right? So we all hear about this vaccine and everything, but you know that the vaccine can't be in the market until it has been approved by the FDA. And of course, also another important element in the risk assessment process is establishing the risk appetite. And what that means, the risk appetite, is really the level of risk the organization views as acceptable. Okay, and that usually has to do with management. The managers of the company, presidents, everything, CEOs, they will establish this. You know, are they risk takers or are they not? Right? It depends, obviously, on the type of business. Usually, companies that are startups have a tendency to be a little bit more of a risk taker because, you know, the company's still trying to make it. Other companies that have a good established market might be risk averse, right? And so the problem there, you know, from a managerial point of view, is that it might affect their future, but you don't really care about that. You just care from the point of view of the IT security management. You know, is the organization willing to take risks or not? And that's going to determine the investment in security practices. All right, from the point of view of the legal and environmental requirements, several industries and the risk context, right? So you can see, for instance, organizations that are less vulnerable are like agriculture, construction. So you don't hear much about somebody hacking some tomatoes, right, somewhere. But as you know, media, education, also they're, you know, less vulnerable. And then you have the businesses or industries that are much more vulnerable, like banking and finance, healthcare, transportation, the government, and so on. Okay, so you really, what that means is, depending on the organization you work for, you have to find where you fall in this range, where you fall. And that's going to determine your context, the laws, and everything like that that influences you. So now that we've looked at all those things, we're going to focus on the three things: assets, threats, and controls. And from there, we're going to try to come up with a tool, you know, the risk and control matrix that could be used to assess your organization. All right, so first of all, we start with asset identification. So we identify the assets. So an asset is anything that needs to be protected. It has value to the organization to meet its objectives. And very importantly, it could be both tangible or intangible. It doesn't have, you know, it's not just, as I said, it's not just a server, but it's intangible things as well. So if this is compromised or lost, it would seriously impact the operation of the organization. And it draws on expertise of people in relevant areas of the organization. So those people are the best ones to tell you about the assets. So here's some terminology. So, we've identified asset, and then we've also talked about threat, vulnerability, and risk. So in this case, a threat is a potential cause of an unwanted incident, which may result in harm to a system or organization. Vulnerability is a weakness in an asset or group of assets which can be exploited by a threat. And then the risk is the potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets to cause loss or damage to those assets. You can see the risk kind of combines all the other three into one single statement. All right. All right, so in the threat identification, now that you have the assets, right, now you need to find those, those dragons, right, that are out there that might cause a threat to, again, the key thing is, how do you think about that? Well, you think about it in terms of the pillars. So anything so a threat is anything that might hinder or prevent an asset from providing appropriate levels of the key security services, or the key principles such as integrity, availability, accountability, authenticity, authentication, confidentiality, reliability. Okay? So all of these So identifying a threat, is identifying the things that can hinder these for you. So threat sources, they could be acts of God, weather, could be man-made, disgruntled employee, a hacker, could be accidental, could be deliberate, right? That's a lot of things, right? So much like they're human threats, right? So usually, or some of them are human threats, so they're going to involve then what's the motivation and so on. Okay. So those are the sources, and you want to start to lay out what these things are. What are the threats to your assets in your organization? Then we have the vulnerability identification. So you want to identify exploitable flaws or weaknesses in the organization's IT systems and processes. Determines the applicability and significance of threat to organization. And you need a combination of threat and vulnerability to create a risk to an asset, which was the definition that we saw before. At the end of the day, once you have the list of assets, you would also end up, as an outcome, you would have a list of threats and vulnerabilities with brief descriptions of how and why they might occur, right? So that's what you're doing as part of the process. You identify a list of assets, a list of the threats, measure those in some way, assign the risk, and then finally, that would take us to, after completing the risk assessment, it would take us to identifying the proper controls to mitigate. So how do you analyze risks? Well, again, that can be baseline or it can be very detailed. In general, you would like to specify some kind of a likelihood of occurrence, right? So likelihood of occurrence. How likely is it? So for instance, hurricanes are a threat, but how likely are they to occur in Indiana? Not very likely. How about a tornado? Much more likely, right? So that, that's really what you're trying to identify. So lots of strong winds, right? Strong winds are likely here, windy city and everything. So, though you want to identify the likelihood of things. And then you want to specify, try to find or quantify consequence should the threat actually occur. Because if a hurricane is very unlikely, but if it hit Indiana, it would be catastrophic, right? So what is the consequence of it? A tornado, it might happen, but it's not as big as a hurricane, so the consequence for your whole organization might be limited. So you start to think about those things. And I'll show you guys at the end of these slides kind of the process that we can follow to arrive at that. So given these ideas, then you try to derive an overall risk rating. And this risk rating could be, like a percentage, like 0.40% accuracy, or 40% accuracy, or it could be just a word. You say, likely, unlikely, very unlikely. So that kind of thing. So you derive that for each threat. So risk really then is basically a probability, the probability that the threat occurs times the cost to the organization. Because if the probability is very high, but the cost is almost negligible, no one's going to care, right? No one cares if the cost is insignificant. And the cost is not just money, it could be reputation to the organization, which eventually would translate into lost sales, which is also money. So you just have to think about it in those terms. So it's hard to determine accurate probabilities and realistic cost consequences. So that's not always very feasible, but you can also always try it. Okay. So sometimes it's better, instead of using quantitative things, to use what are called qualitative ratings, which is really what I said, just having these words, likely, unlikely, very unlikely, and so on. Okay. Once you have the assets, once you have the threats, the next step is to have the controls. Okay. So you analyze existing controls, or the controls that you're going to have in place. And these are the controls used to attempt to minimize threats. So existing controls used to attempt to minimize threats. So these controls can be divided into three things, which are managerial controls, operational controls, and technical controls. So for instance, obviously, OpenSSL cryptography, that's a technical control. But what about the person that every day walks around the office looking at the servers and computers and everything, and then just signs a document? They sign it, do a sign off that says, yeah, I checked all of these and they're all there, right? So that's not a technical control, but it's definitely a control. What about the turns? When somebody tries to hack into your system, if you have a little, above the login page, a little message that says, if you attempt to gain unauthorized access to the system, you will be, prosecuted legally, right? So with criminal charges and things like that. Well, if you think about that, that's a deterrent, and it's not technical, but it is quite effective. The law, obviously, is always quite effective. You can say whatever you want, whenever you want, but breaking the law is another matter. All right, so use checklist of existing controls and interview key organizational staff to solicit information. So that would be a good way to do this process of the analysis of existing controls. All right, so now that we've talked about all of this, we can bring it together by creating ways of quantifying risk. So let's call this the risk likelihood register, right? So it's just a rating system from 1 through 5. And you say something like, what is the likely description? Rare, unlikely, possible, likely, almost certain. So what is the likelihood that eventually, when you have a server data center with 1,000 servers, what's the likelihood that one of those hard drives is just going to corrupt? It's almost certain that it will happen eventually. Okay. Or that you're going to lose some data, at some point. That's very likely. So you should create backups and things like that. The important thing is that you create this rating system now, and the rating system is going to allow you to the rating system will allow you to start to quantify in the process and lay it out in a good logical form. The risk consequences, that's another thing that you can do. You can define, so for instance, what are the risks? You know, again, a rating from 1 through 6 where you have it's insignificant or it's minor, moderate, major, catastrophic, doomsday, right? So for the airline industry, this whole pandemic has been, you know, major, if not catastrophic, right? So there's been a lot of affected employees, pilots, you know, other people that work the counters, etc., mechanics, I assume. So you know, all these things. You know, you want to have ways of measuring these things, and you don't have to necessarily have some complex equations, but these are good enough sometimes. Okay. Remember that at the end of the day, let's not lose sight of what we're doing. We're trying to secure our organization. So we have a process of identifying the organization, the assets, the threats, the controls, and so on. All right. Then once we have all of those elements, we can actually now, this is the RCM. This is the RCM basically, as you can see. That's why I usually just call it an Excel spreadsheet. If you think about it, this is like an Excel, spreadsheet, right? You know, in that it has a whole bunch of columns and they're all related. So if you think about it here, we start with, and this, as I said, is called the RCM, or risk and control matrix. So this is really a matrix. All right, so if you think about it, you have assets, right? You identify them, and think of this here, you know, the internet router, but also destruction of the data center. And then let's say here, it's just like user data. All right. And then once you've identified these 3 items, right, you've identified one, you know, let's say 1, 2, 3, right? You have the 3 items, then you identify the threats. So the threats could be an outside hacker attack, accidental fire, you know, ransomware. Then once you have those elements, you look at the existing controls to mitigate these. So for an internet router, for an attacker to not hack the router, it would be good to have passwords, obviously, or even cryptography, and for authentication, things like that, you know, public, private keys, etc. For a destruction of data center, if there's a fire or a flood, you know, if there's no control, no disaster recovery plan, then certainly you need to consider what you're going to do about that. Now, the amount of resources that you invest in dealing with this depends on a lot of things. So that's why you have the likelihood and the consequence, right, which allow you to end the level of risk. So in this case, you can say, for instance, you know, the likelihood of a hacker hacking into the router is possible, okay, but the consequence is moderate. If it does happen, it's a moderate. So then, therefore, you can conclude that the level of risk is high for that one. Now, the next example is interesting. It says the destruction of a data center. So here, the likelihood of that happening is it's very unlikely. But the consequence is major. Obviously, if you lose the data center, that's a serious thing. So even then, you can conclude, okay, this one is high. Okay. Now, if you have a situation where the likelihood is unlikely and the consequence is minor, then the level of risk you might expect would be low, quite low. All right. And then based on that information, you can assign risk priority. So you can start assigning the priority of each item. Okay. All right. So this is one of the most important slides of this lecture today. Are there any questions? No questions? Okay. All right, seems like it's making sense. All right, so I should say, you know, on Thursday we're doing the scavenger hunt, but today I'm going to give you a simple little homework for this one, which is going to be due, next week is Thanksgiving, right? Thursday. So then you'll be busy. So we'll probably make that homework due on Tuesday then. Okay, given that I'm assigning it today. And it's just going to be related to this. So I'll explain that in a sec. And then you can work on this. You can work in the same pairs that you worked on for the Pi Crypto. Okay. And then you can just submit one report. Everyone should submit the report, just indicate in the report who your partner was. But we'll talk about that in a second. So what I want you to understand is that, you know, this is a process, right? And so I've explained it. So that's why I'm asking if there's any questions. But it seems like there weren't any questions. Okay. So next week I will continue with the other example, the other set of slides. But let's see. I'm almost to the end of this. Oops. Okay, here we go. So now, obviously, when you make decisions about risks, it's really, there's a relationship, right, of what you're going to do. So for instance, there's going to be the risk level, you know, is it very risky or not, extreme risk, low risk? And then there's also the cost of treating the risk, so the control, right? So it could be very cheap or very expensive. So based on that, you're going to make this, you know, you're going to make decisions. So for instance, it's very simple. If the regard, you know, if the risk is anywhere here, right, but the cost is in this area, right, in that area, well, it's cheap, right? So now if it's low, you may not implement it. If the risk is extreme, right, but the cost is also very low, then you basically implement the treatment. It's a no-brainer, right? On the other end, if the risk is very low in this area and the cost is just astronomical, really high, then it's uneconomic. So you accept. Okay, you basically accept the risk. It's too expensive. You're not going to spend a fortune on something that's very unlikely. Now, this gray area here, dark gray area, is the area where more judgment is needed because it seems to be proportional, right? So as the risk starts to go up, the cost will go up, which makes sense. So you kind of have to figure out the balance. You know, how much risk can you take? How much can you mitigate, etc. Okay, so that's the judgment about the risk assessment. Okay. All right, so we talked about this, or risk treatment alternatives. So, you know, do you accept the risk, avoid the risk, etc. So you can read through that. Now, let's do, I'm just going to do this last little case study. And, you know, and then I'm going to assign the lab. Okay, so we're gonna look at this. So basically, which is, like I said, it's like a research. It's an easy homework. It's a very easy homework. All right. So the homework that I'm going to give you is the following. I'm going to ask you guys in your group that you're working with your partner, you're going to submit a report in a week, on Tuesday, a week from today. And basically what you have to do is you have to write a report where you will find a company, find any company that you like, right? Any organization, you know, a bank, Facebook, you know, any kind of thing. I don't need it to be a very big report, right? So 2-3 pages at most, but you need to create something that looks like that, and something that looks like this slide, okay, like that slide. So our risk and control matrix. So that risk and control matrix needs to contain the assets, the risks, and the controls for the organization that you are analyzing. So really what I'll be looking for is that one table, okay? So here we have the example of the case study Silver Star Mines. And so what do you do? So think about, so let's say you're doing this Silver Star Mines, but it's going to be whatever company you want to do. Obviously, if you do a healthcare one, think of the implications of healthcare law. If it's a publicly traded company, think of the implications of that, you know, all kinds of things. So with Silver Star Mines, you have a fictional operation of a global mining company, right? So it's a global company, it's kind of industrial. They're probably governed by things related to the environment, you know, that kind of thing. They have a large IT infrastructure. They have both common and specific software. So that means software that they bought and software that they developed in-house. Some of it is related to health and safety because they have to keep the safety of their employees as a priority. And they used to have old technology that is now networked. Okay, so this is an example. Obviously, you have to do this for your own organization that you selected, company. You have to figure out the legal and regulatory requirements, and then you need to kind of say, okay, what is the perceived level of accepted risk for this organization? You know, do they accept a lot of risk? Can they afford to accept a lot of risk, et cetera? And then really, so just do that analysis, and then after that, what I'm going to ask you is to find out what the assets would be. You know, this is just a you know, like a case study. So again, you know, you think of it in terms of the principles, right? So reliability and integrity of the SCADA nodes. So SCADAs are like computers that control all the manufacturing or excavation or conveyor belt systems and things like that. So they're just computers. But how do you protect that integrity, right? How do you protect the integrity of the stored and databases, availability, integrity of the financial system, procurement system, the maintenance systems, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the email system, right? So think of all the assets that they might have. This is just a brief example. You can expect more. And then tie it to the principles, right? So find the assets, then say what principle applies to it, okay? Once you do that, try to identify what would be the risks associated. So for instance here, you know, email, right? The mail service or email service has been linked here, and you talk about the confidentiality of it. You can break this out into 2 tables, then find the threat. So what's the threat of this? Well, errors affecting the system, somebody hacking the information, and then you will identify the controls that should be in place. You see that? What are the controls that should be in place? Firewalls, you know, encryption, but also administrative things, training. And then you go through the motions of likelihood, consequence, and level of risk. So for instance, the likelihood of somebody attacking the conveyor belts would be a rare thing, but it has a consequence that's major, therefore it's a high risk. The only one here that has a medium risk is availability and integrity of maintenance and production system. So, you know, the consequence is minor. It could happen, but, you know, it's not really going to affect the operations of the organization right away, and therefore you identify it as medium, and then you can do a risk priority. Now, this only has like 5 things. I would suggest that you have it, you know, between 40 and 50 assets. So you can always, you know, I just want you to go through the motions. Also, break this, or let's say 60 assets actually. Break it up into, or sorry, you know, 40, 50, it doesn't matter, but, you know, just not 5, 40, I say. Anything greater than 40, let's say. And then break it up into tangible and intangible ones. So try to think, I'm not saying it's going to be a 50-50 split, but you know, yeah, definitely have some servers and things like that, but also information. Now, again, all of this will depend on the company that you pick. So I do want you to pick a real business, okay? So Netflix, a hospital, you know, whatever you want. I leave it to you guys. Just go through this exercise. As I said, it can be a short 2-3 page document. I will really be looking mainly for this. Okay, this is the thing that I'm going to take a look at. Okay? Are there any questions about this, guys?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment, okay. Okay, so as far, it's just like a report. It's not a research paper, it's just a report like any lab report. Right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create now the link on Brightspace. That's what I'm gonna do. And I'm gonna create, so you can, so can you guys see the Brightspace? You should be able to see the Brightspace now. And
Yeah, we can.
Great. And then what I'm gonna say here is, I'm gonna create a new link, new assignment. And as I said, this is a very easy one. So this is easy points, but be aware you will have a question exactly like this on the exam. And I'm just going to call it, you know, RCM homework. You can do this in groups of 2 and both, but everyone should submit a report so I can grade you. Easily just specify who is your partner for the group. This will be due on the 24th. 11:59. I'll give an extra couple of days. But you probably want to be done before Thanksgiving. So what am I asking you to do? Work with your partner. Okay. Right. And basically perform a risk and control assessment of a company, of a real company, of your choice. You know, and provide a 2-3 page report that includes the RCM as described in class, right? Remember, this is a mapping. This is a mapping of assets to threats to controls. For all assets, identify the principles of information assurance that are affected and the likelihood, consequence, and level of risk. And the likelihood, consequence, and level. Basically that Excel spreadsheet, okay? Does this make sense, guys?
Yeah, it makes sense.
You need me to say anything else? I think it's pretty clear.
No, I think that's good.
Let's see, I got some questions on the chat. Right, so it's basically that slide, that slide that I showed that had all of these parameters together. Think of this, I always tell students when I talk, that's why I always call this the RCM, right? The RCM means the risk and control matrix. So it's literally like an Excel spreadsheet where you're tying all these things together, okay? All right, guys? So this is the lab, so the assignment, sorry, yeah, lab. The assignment, so you will submit this, so it's now posted. All right, and you will submit this 1 week from today. It's simple 2-3 page report. As I said, I'm looking for that. I'll be looking really for that page where you have the Excel spreadsheet and all the information. Obviously, I need to know what company you did, and I'll take a look at it to make sure it makes sense. Okay, it makes sense from the point of view of, you say Netflix, and then, you know, what are the things that you think are threats to Netflix? What do you, so let's do Netflix. What do you think are some assets of Netflix that need protecting? What would you say?
Their media, so movies, TV shows.
That's right, right? They have a lot of media that they pay a lot of contracts for. They definitely need to protect that. Contracts.
People have to be able to watch it whenever they want.
The availability. That, and remember, that's the principle of availability. What else? When they send data over the internet, right? Over the insecure internet, it has to do what?
Has to make sure it's encrypted.
Encrypted and achieve which principle?
Confidentiality.
Confidentiality, right, right.
Also need to be able to store like user account information and passwords and such securely as well.
We all have to pay for Netflix, right? So there's all of that. Exactly. They don't want people stealing the service, etc. Very good. So that's really the idea. Okay. Any questions?
No, I don't think so. At least not right now.
Okay, great. So the rest of the slides that I have on here, we will continue next week. All right, next Tuesday, I'll finish up those slides. For the rest of the time today, I'll just I'll stay here until the end of class if you have any questions about this assignment. So I'm going to, at this time, I'm going to pause the video.